We've got some breaking news this morning that we wanted to bring to you. Israeli special forces are storming Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza. This is the largest remaining functioning hospital in the entire Gaza Strip. We can put some images that are coming out this morning. These are courtesy of Middle East Eye. You can see, and by the way, this is very difficult to watch, but you can see some of the horror unfolding there in the hospital. I'm actually going to read the report here from New York Times. They say Israel sent troops into Nasser Medical Complex on Thursday in what it described as a, quote, limited operation against Hamas, raising concerns about the fate of hundreds of patients and medical workers and the many thousands of displaced Palestinians who had sought shelter there from the war. The raid came 2 days after Israel's military ordered displaced people to evacuate the hospital. Put a pin in that piece because I've got some news for you there as well. This is the largest hospital in southern Gaza and one of the last ones even functioning in the enclave. This, of course, as Israel has made targeting hospitals a real focus of this operation, something that was previously absolutely unheard of, something that was sparking earlier in this operation huge debates about whether this was justified. Of course, hospitals typically completely off limits in terms of the rules of war, not so in terms of Israeli operations in Gaza. They go on to say this came after warnings by health officials that a military operation there could be catastrophic for civilians. A Gazan health ministry spokesman said the Israeli military demolished the southern wall of the complex and begun storming it, overrunning the ambulance center and an area where displaced people have been living in tents. He said Israeli forces were attacking the hospital's orthopedic department and had killed one patient and injured several others. As far as the Israeli military, what they are saying is that the special forces soldiers are, quote, conducting a precise and limited operation inside Nasser against Hamas, which it accused of hiding in the hospital among wounded civilians. Israel, which has said Hamas uses hospitals across Gaza as cover for military operations, said it had intelligence, including from released hostages, that Hamas had held captives at the hospital and that their bodies might be there. Israeli authorities, though, also lowering expectations that they will actually be able to find and recover any of the bodies of those hostages. So take that justification for what it's worth. Of course, this comes in a broader context, Saagar, of you initially had people pushed out of northern Gaza into Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis became a real center of the population. Khan Yunis has been under massive attack and bombardment from the Israelis. People have been pushed down to Rafah. We are still waiting to see what happens there, but already bombardment of Rafah has started as well. So you had thousands of Palestinians who had sheltered in this hospital, in this medical complex, thinking, apparently wrongly, that hospitals may be a safer location to shelter. And now even this hospital also being targeted. One more thing with regard to the initial order to evacuate, because this is absolutely horrifying. Put this report from The Intercept up on the screen. They did a good job on reporting this out. So the headline here is IDF sent in handcuffed prisoner to evacuate hospital, then killed him when he left. Basically, the entirety of the story here is in the headline. They sent a Palestinian prisoner in handcuffed, I think basically zip-tied handcuffs, into this hospital to tell them that they had to leave or they would all be killed. And then on the way out, his mother, I believe, was there in the hospital begging him not to go back out. But he said, they threatened me. If I don't leave, the civilians here at this hospital are at risk. He left, and then the Israelis shot him. And this was all documented by The Intercept and by witnesses on the scene. So yet another scene of horror emerging out of the Gaza Strip and hospital that had been serving as a sanctuary for many displaced Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is the Israelis are already downplaying, as you said, some of the initial claims about why they're going into the hospital, and they didn't exactly have the best track record in terms of what happened earlier in Gaza City. So they're going to have to show results if they want to continue to justify this. As you saw from the footage as well, it's pretty terrifying about what exactly that looks like. And the question too, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because it's the last remaining one. The question is that it's going to be irreparably damaged such that it can continue medical facility. This is the last bastion, I guess, of healthcare for Doctors Without Borders, for many others. It also is one of the easier ways, when supplies are able to get through, to be able to get it to this hospital. So if it does shut down, it would obviously constitute basically a absolute shutdown of all healthcare in the entire strip. So Very terrifying
Yeah.
in terms of what's happening right now.
Absolutely. And by the way, I should say the doctors and hospital administrators absolutely deny the claims that are being made here by the Israelis being used as justification for the storming of a hospital, which again, I think the news media has almost become accustomed to hospitals being targeted in this conflict, but this is very much outside of the norms of modern warfare. As I said previously, hospitals should be completely off limits, and it is a war crime to target them except in the most exceptional of circumstances. And since we had sort of these, debates early on, and there was this overwhelming propaganda campaign to justify some of the early hospital attacks, some of the latter ones have gone barely without notice, not to mention the targeting of ambulances, the targeting of other healthcare clinics and facilities. And this comes, of course, as there's been a massive shortage of medical supplies as well, such that you've had children having to undergo amputations without anesthetic, women having to give birth and suffer through cesareans without anesthetic. I did see some videos online this morning that, I can't verify, but would comport with the reality of what's unfolding. Women who have literally just given birth half an hour before being forced to evacuate the hospital with their babies. I can't actually even imagine what that would be like. At the same time as we're watching that, there are other significant developments. Let's put this up on the screen. Report from the Wall Street Journal. The U.S. is reportedly probing some Israeli strikes that killed civilians in Gaza and the possible use of white phosphorus in Lebanon. The investigation could result in new conditions being set on the delivery of U.S. weapons to Israel. I would not hold my breath on that second part. They even go on to say in this report that the probes are not indicative of a broader policy shift. But Saagar, they're basically looking at two separate incidents here, both of which we've reported on here on this show. One was that attack on the Jabalia refugee camp near Gaza City. It killed more than 125 people, according to U.S. officials. Israel had said they were targeting a Hamas commander in a tunnel under a high-rise building. It appears they used a 2,000-pound bomb in that strike on that refugee camp. That is why there were so many deaths and so many casualties. We're talking about huge numbers of women and children who were killed in that strike. The State Department reportedly probing basically to see whether or not this was a war crime. The other incident that they are investigating is one that the Washington Post did extensive reporting on, and we talked about here as well, and that was the use of white phosphorus in Lebanon in ways that are also inconsistent with the laws of war. Again, I would not raise your expectations that this is going to result in much, if anything, but you have a quote here from Sarah Yeager, former human rights advisor to the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff, now serves as Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. She called the continuing investigations a, quote, much needed step for the U.S., but also expressed, as she should, a lot of skepticism about the impact, saying, quote, will it lead to anything? That's where I'm less confident about how great this thing is. To be effective, she said, very senior U.S. officials will need to take the findings seriously and act on them. This kind of trust of policymakers to do the right thing has a history of not working out so well. Let's see. And I believe it was Matt Miller, State Department spokesman. It might have been Jake Sullivan or Matt Miller. I can't remember. I get all these schools confused. But basically sort of downplayed this probe and what it might also mean from the podium.
I have the quote here. He says, the process is not intended to function as rapid response. Rather, it is designed to systematically assess civilian harm incidents and develop appropriate policy responses to reduce the risk of such incidents occurring in the future. I mean, the big question is like, look, I mean, at a certain point, I almost just find this annoying because we reported on it months ago. Anybody with a brain can see that it's obviously white phosphorus, not from the attack, but because we've been able to assess white phosphorus attacks previously in, let's say, Russia and in Syria with almost instantaneous results. But this has been, I mean, how long has it been since this white phosphorus attack? I remember covering it in the early days. I mean, it's been several months. So why is it that when Russia uses white phosphorus, we can be like, oh, this is an obvious, clear use of white phosphorus munitions, where we don't even have technically like a ground ability or investigation or an ally there to be able to verify it. Same with the Syrians. Like, we can automatically say, oh, Assad used X exact chemical weapon, you know, whenever this happened. But here it's like 5 months later, whenever we're the ones who sold it to them, then it just disappears.
Yeah.
It's just laughable. You know, it's one of those where don't lie to our faces. And because then also, what if you do conclude, what if you do conclude that it was used? What are you going to do about it? Are you going to follow official U.S. law? The law says you're not allowed to do that. You get cut off. You have a
That's
restriction.
right.
That's literally what the State Department, the Leahy Law, and other things that ascribe for U.S. military aid. Now, the president can waive that, but then it's like, well, what are we even doing here? If we all know that you're probably not going to do it. It could be maybe a pretext, Krystal, for in the future they can cut it off whenever they want. But I mean, 6 months from now, is it really going to matter? Who knows?
I think it basically
Yeah.
just gives, ghouls like Matt Miller something to say at the podium. Oh, we're investigating that. And then the investigation can take months and months and months and never really come to a conclusion. Or by the time there is a conclusion, it's way too late for it to even matter. And they'll, tis Israel do better in the future, but it'll have no real impact. Something that Ryan and others have been pressing State Department people about has been, their go-to justification for like the killing of Hind and the medics who were trying to rescue her, that 6-year-old little girl that I did the monologue on. They'll, ask, okay, well, what about this? What do you think about this? Have you talked about the Israelis about this? Isn't this a war crime? And they'll say, oh, we've talked to the Israelis, an investigation is ongoing. They've done this for months at this point about a whole variety of war crimes that have been reported out and are clear as day. And they always just push it out, oh, an investigation is ongoing. And so they've started following up like, well, what about that investigation? What are the results? When are we going to hear the results? And of course, it's just a dodge. It's just a way to get out of the moment and pretend like they care at all when obviously by their actions, they clearly do not. The other thing that they've been getting pressed on quite a bit is, hey, your whole strategy of giving Israel total and complete support and then just occasionally leaking to the press that you're very concerned about this or that. How is that going for you? They had to admit the other day, in many instances, it's not going that well. And I think a case in point on that is on something that is so basic, it's insane that the supposed superpower, the United States of America, cannot even accomplish pressing the Israelis to deliver a shipment of flour that we reportedly made clear to them was important to us. The Israelis are blocking that shipment because they say it's going to UNRWA. Of course, we help them with that psyop by buying into the completely evidence-free claims that they leveled against UNRWA, and we cut their funding, and that led a whole cascade of countries around the world to cut their funding. So in any case, Jake Sullivan getting pressed about how the Israelis are blocking this shipment of flour to Gaza at a time when a majority of Palestinians there are absolutely starving. And Cindy McCain, head of World Food Program, is saying kids are now literally starving to death. Let's take a listen to how he responds.
Well, it's why we're asking the question on the aid coming through. And you're right, that flour has not moved the way that we had expected it would move. And we expect that Israel will follow through on its commitment to get that flour into Gaza. But we are asking the question, how do you do something like Rafah and make sure all those innocent people not only are protected physically, but can have access to aid? That is precisely the point that we are pressing on quite actively as we speak.
That flour has not moved the way that we expected it to move. I also love that phrasing, like the flour, it's the flour's fault. Like the flour's just not getting it together and moving where it's supposed to move. But think of how pathetic this is and how outrageous it is, even especially in the wake of the ICJ report that called on Israel to make sure they were improving the aid situation, that they were rushing more aid in, and instead here they are completely blocking the shipment of flour that the U.S. officials at least claim to say that they care about getting in.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the Bill Clinton behind-the-scenes quote whenever Netanyahu was badgering him, trying to get him on the phone, and he said, quote, "Who's the fucking superpower here?" This was behind the scenes. So I never expected to praise Bill Clinton, but I guess here I am.
Yeah.
Let's put this also up on the screen, please. D3, the BBC News tear sheet, because this is just one of those that we need to watch very closely. There was a major airstrike yesterday in Lebanon. Lebanese government claiming 10 people were killed. This was retaliatory after Lebanon or Hezbollah launched attacks inside of Israel, which killed at least some members of the IDF. Israel's military said it was hitting, quote, Hezbollah infrastructure in response to a deadly rocket attack on northern Israel. Always just a reminder that as tensions and all these things ratchet up, this is probably the most strategically important place, for where things could pop off. We've seen things like this happen in the past, but we also know that the Netanyahu government and the defense minister are chomping at the bit to be able to enter Lebanon or to mount some sort of attack, already calling it the axis of evil, saying we can do to Lebanon what we did to Gaza. They should watch out. There have been behind the scenes talks about some sort of negotiated ceasefire, but I mean, this is very obvious, that it hasn't happened. And it's also just a consistent reminder that any explosion of conflict between Lebanon and Israel would be 10 to 15 times more deadly than anything that's going on in Gaza. Gaza is a basically asymmetric conflict. Hamas has nothing, 1/10 or something of Hezbollah's overall military strength. Hezbollah is a very, very strong military organization. I'm not saying they would win, but they would definitely be able to put up a fight, and it would decimate the entire country.
Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has been warning Israel and Israeli leaders. This is in that piece that we just had up on the screen, in a speech that launching a war against the group would result in 1 million evacuees from northern Israel. Right now, I think there's maybe 100,000 Israelis who have been evacuated from northern Israel. Quote, to those who threaten us with a widening of the war, if you widen, we will too, he said, adding that those who think the resistance might be afraid are mistaken. Also vowed that Hezbollah would only cease fire when the aggression stops, and there is a ceasefire in Gaza. And it is incredibly important to keep this already widened war in perspective, because I actually, NBC News did a great job putting this map together of the way that the conflict has spread. And when you see it, it really is astonishing the number of countries that have been pulled in at this point. I mean, you're talking about Lebanon, you're talking about Israel, obviously Israel, Gaza, you're talking about Syria, you're talking about Iraq, you're talking about Iran, you're even talking about freaking Pakistan getting pulled in. I mean, it's just a huge regional swath. Of course, Yemen, the Red Sea, and then you have U.S. leaders pretending like, oh, our goal to keep this confined to Gaza is totally working out when we're bombing multiple countries over a single weekend. And when these strikes, tit-for-tat strikes between Hezbollah and Israel have been going on consistently since post-October 7th, so we never want to lose sight of that. At the same time, there was I was pretty skeptical, but a little bit of renewed hope that potentially there may be some new ceasefire deal lasting potentially 6 weeks on the table. But it looks like Bibi is backing out of those talks completely. Put this up on the screen. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the Israeli delegation not to return to Cairo. That's where the negotiations were ongoing for further negotiations for a hostage release deal with Hamas that were scheduled to take place in the Egyptian capital today. In light of the move, by the way, the families of hostages are absolutely furious. They said they intend to demonstrate in front of the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv in protest of, quote, the decision to sacrifice the lives of the hostages. And, I mean, I'm a broken record on this. We've talked about it 1,000 times. Bibi has no incentive to end this war. He's fearful that if there is some significant length of a ceasefire, that it'll be very difficult to go back to the overwhelming level of aggression that they have been using in the Gaza Strip previously. So he does not want to make a deal. The far-right parts of his coalition are dead set against it and have basically threatened to completely blow up his government if he goes forward with any sort of significant deal with Hamas. So that's why I've been skeptical that this would work out from the beginning. But you do have this counter-domestic pressure of the families of hostages, and not just the families of hostages, but the majority of Israelis who want the primary goal of the war to be returning the hostages. And so, short-circuiting and pulling out completely of these negotiated talks, any sort, really short-circuiting any possibility that they're going to come to a deal in the short term could be very politically difficult for him to sustain domestically. Obviously, the U.S. has made clear that we want them to be involved in some of the ceasefire. They clearly don't give a shit about what we have to say. And since the Biden administration is completely unwilling to use any sort of actual leverage or pressure, I don't think our stance on this it's pretty much irrelevant, whatever our stance on this is. So, Saagar, really the only hope you have for pressure is coming from the Israeli domestic populace.
I feel for them. I really do, especially the families and all of them, because it's just so difficult. Because you have a military operation being mounted in your name. You've only had 2 people be rescued, and then you have active attempts at this point where the government is antithetical to the overall aims. It really, when you pair it like that and you look, and all that to the future, the government is really not responding to the wills of the populace. And that's one of those where, that's why I do find it outrageous in many respects is, we talk about Israel as a monolith. It's not, it may not necessarily align with some of the most pro-Palestinian people, but it's a nuanced country. And they really do want an actual ceasefire, or not a ceasefire deal, but a hostage negotiation deal. Yeah. And they probably would be willing to put up with the ceasefire, at least for a prolonged period of time, if it meant the release of all of their hostages. So they and the government do not agree on this. The government's position is a ceasefire for maybe a portion of time before a resumption of hostilities. I haven't seen enough polling, though, to confirm my suspicion, but basically from what we've seen, I think a decent portion of the public would probably agree to at least a significant ceasefire of several months in exchange for all of the hostages to be released.
There was that poll, and I'm going to get the numbers roughly correct, but don't quote me on the exact numbers here. But they asked Israelis, is your top priority for this war bringing home the hostages or eradicating Hamas? And a majority said the top priority should be bringing home the hostages.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was somewhere in the 30s, like I want to say like 36% that said the goal should be eradicating Hamas. But the reality of the Netanyahu coalition is, it's extremely far right and very tied in with the most fringe elements within Israeli society. I mean, that's why they're not only allowing but encouraging these psycho demonstrators to block aid from going into the Strip. This is being done with the tacit and sometimes explicit support of the Israeli government. So that is the type of ideology that you're dealing with here.
There you go.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.